Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the Enlightenment Part 2 in our continuing study of the history of Christianity. Our timeline so far of church history, we're focusing lately on the Reformation. Notice we have people like Luther and Calvin. You have, at an earlier period, you'd had the Renaissance, beginning mostly in Italy, and then its influence moving further to the north. The Reformation overlaps, but comes a bit later. We start the Reformation, usually we think of 1517, with Luther hammering his 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg Castle. But then we come now to the Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason. And again, notice there's a little bit of an overlap between Reformation and Enlightenment. Now, the Reformation had been a questioning of the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. In the West, that had been the church, and Luther had and others like Zwingli had initially tried to reform it from within, and when they were unsuccessful, they ended up either breaking off or being broken off from that church to start what we think of as the Reformed churches. Meanwhile, the Enlightenment coming in the next era is a questioning of the authority of the church, which that's how it started, but also notice also government traditions. And it's not just the Roman Catholic Church that's being questioned now. Now it's all church authorities, both Roman Catholic, but also the various Protestant churches as well. The first Reformation had been Bible driven, a quest to get back to the scriptures. What do the scriptures teach as opposed to what the church is teaching? The Enlightenment is more science driven, science, observation, philosophy, and it's going to impact, in some degree, how people even understand the Bible. Now, from the Enlightenment, notice we have they're questioning the authority of the church. That's going to lead to a rise of deism, the idea that yes, there's a God, but he created the world and he went off on vacation. He doesn't interact with with our world today. Agnosticism. And also a secularization movement where it's not that they're denying God, but they're sort of ignoring him. It's dealing as if there were no God, even though if you ask a lot of people, they'd say, oh, certainly I believe in God or a God, but they're acting as if he's not there. So notice a questioning of the authority of the church, but also of government. And that's going to lead to an age of revolution. Now, let's begin with the scientific revolution, some astronomical advances, these are the most obvious. You'd had Ptolemy back before Christ, had come out with what they thought of as the geocentric model. And we say of the solar system, but actually he would have said of the universe. They didn't really have an idea of galaxies and things like that. So they were just looking at the entire universe, and he felt that at the center of the universe was the Earth. Now Copernicus had come out in 1542 with his heliocentric model, the idea that the sun is at the center. And remember, we would say the center of the solar system. He would say the center of the universe. They haven't looked beyond. They haven't really grasped the immensity of the universe. Although they're going to begin to try to take measurements, very unsuccessful at first. But he comes out with this heliocentric model. Galileo, by the time we get to 1610, confirmed that heliocentric model through actual observations with his telescope. And remember, he gets into hot water he's living in Italy, so he gets into trouble with the Roman Catholic Church, and they tell him, recant what with your observations, and he does that. He does that. He was saying, look, I'm just presenting, evidence for the different theories. You have Kepler, notice we've gotten to 1609 now, who gives the laws of planetary motion. He's primarily a mathematician, and so he's taking these observations and drawing them to their conclusion. And finally, we've got Isaac Newton. Notice from now we get to 1687, much later in the 1600s, who's going to give theoretical explanations of why Kepler's law works. And so the laws of gravity and inertia and how this all can be explained. Now, back in Luther's day, He says in his Table Talk is a series of just, these were not sermons, these were not major books that were being written. These were just conversations around the dinner table. And normally what would happen, his students would take notes, and afterwards they would sort of collate them, and they've been published. And notice there, you can sort of specify as to when this conversation is taking place. He says there was a mention of a certain new astrologer. Now you say, wait a second, astrologer? I thought we were talking about astronomy. We're going to see that at that time they were considered one and the same, even by those who did the work of astronomy slash astrology. He goes on, there was a mention of a certain new astrologer who wanted to prove that the earth moves and not the sky, the sun, and the moon. This would be as if somebody were riding on a cart or in a ship and imagined that he was standing still while the earth and the trees were moving. Notice he just sort of rejects it out of hand. It's not that he studied it or anything like that. He's heard about it. This is hearsay, and he's carrying on a conversation. He continues. So it goes now. Whoever wants to be clever must agree with nothing that others esteem. He must do something of his own. This is what that fellow does who wishes to turn the whole of astronomy upside down. The commonly accepted, can I say it, the scientific theory of astronomy prior to this had been that the Earth is at the center. They had borrowed from Aristotle. They had borrowed from the quote unquote scientists of the past. And Luther accepted those ideas. He goes on, even in these things that are thrown into disorder, I believe the Holy Scriptures. And then he wants to give a scriptural basis for this Ptolemaic model. He says, "For Joshua commanded the sun to stand still and not the earth." Now, let me just say that most Christians today would look at Joshua's command and the way that's described in the book of Joshua as something that speaking of the way things appear, just like if you look at the news this morning, the weatherman might have said, "Hey, the sun is going to rise at such and such time." You say, "Well, doesn't he know that it's not the sun rising; it's actually the earth turning?" Yes, but we talk that way, and so most Christians today would agree with that and would take issue with Luther and with some of these other approaches that were contrary to Copernicus, that were saying no, it's the sun and the moon and the planets. That of course we know today that they're all moving, but in relationship with the sun, the Earth goes around the sun, and most Christians agree with that today. They don't argue about that, which leads me to an interesting point that we ought to be careful when we think that perhaps the scriptures and science are at odds. It might be. It might be at times that our understanding of the scripture is the one that is in error. I'm not saying that's always the case. Science, science has been an error in the past, and it had been at this point. Just at this point that Luther is addressing, he's actually taking the science, what had been the scientific premise of his day, um, but it was an error. And so we want to be careful about taking such positions. Calvin, in a sermon I think it's dealing with somewhere in 1 Corinthians around chapter 13, 12, 13, 14, somewhere in there, says something similar, takes a position that, and it's just in passing. The whole sermon's not about that. But he makes a passing comment about those who are trying to sort of turn the world upside down, saying the earth moves. And again, he's not really addressing the science of it, but he's saying such ideas, such new ideas are dangerous and ought to be rejected. And he was wrong as well. Kepler comes along. He says, my aim is to show that the heavenly machine is not a kind of divine living being, as some had maybe suggested, but a kind of clockwork. And he who believes that a clock is a soul attributes the maker's glory to the work, insofar as nearly all the manifold motions are caused by a most simple magnetic and material force, just as all motions of the clock are caused by a simple weight. Now, notice Kepler says, because it's a machine, because it's a clock, that presupposes a clockmaker. He's not denying God. He's just saying, I'm trying to understand what God has built, how God has brought this about. So we had astrology and astronomy. Today we look at them as two separate things. Back then, the science of the day actually put these two together. They thought, if I can better understand the movement of whether it's the Earth or the moon, whatever's moving, the better I can take my astrological readings, because there was a feeling out there, held by many scientists, that the movement of the planets and things like that, and the Earth, if it did move, those all actually affected life here on Earth and affected people and so on like that. Likewise, there were ideas where alchemy and chemistry, today we look at alchemy as sort of a silly approach, whereas chemistry is the scientific study of chemicals, and yet back then it was considered one and the same. Um, Likewise, in the areas of anatomy, there's going to be new studies. For the first time, people are actually going to do dissections, not just of animals, but of dead people. The church had actually not allowed that previously. And advances in mathematics. We come to Rene Descartes, a Cartesian philosophy that he held that says just doubt everything. um, when in doubt, be in doubt. He says, if you would be a real seeker after truth, it is necessary that at least once in your life, now, it doesn't say you're supposed to live in doubt, but at least once in your life, you doubt as far as possible all things, question everything, and begin and then move forward from there. Don't Not that you stay in a realm of questioning, but you go back to the beginning. This sort of reminds me of those who um, those humanists who said, let's go back to the source, go back to the beginning, and work it out from there. He's the one who said, I think, therefore I am. Notice he'd been questioning his very existence. Do I exist? He says, well, someone is having these thoughts, and therefore I exist. Therefore, what am I? That's a different question. But I exist, and I can move forward from there. Similarly, he takes Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God, simplifies it to Anselm had gotten a little bit verbose, and because of that, people had attacked it. He simplifies it and makes it clearer, and says, in a sense, arguing with God is like arguing against the number two. It's sort of obvious that it exists, and he feels like it's obvious that God exists. Now the attributes of God, that's something that could be argued. Something that could be questioned. What is God like? But the very existence of God, he thinks that's just silly to try to argue against. The Roman Catholic Church, I don't think because of the ontological argument that he uses, but for other reasons, they're going to ban his books in 1663. Blaise Pascal, he's also in the 1600s. He seeks a separation of reason and logic from faith. He says the heart has its reasons of which reason knows nothing. So he's also become a Christian, not necessarily a churchman. He actually struggled with faith in God early on, but he had a near death experience and a crisis of faith that left him rejecting the church but accepting God and accepting Christianity. And so he continues to be skeptical of the church. Of course, the church in his day, you'd had both the Roman Catholic and you'd had the Lutheran and other Protestant churches. So you've got a variety to choose from. And he seems to be skeptical of all of that. His pensée, his thoughts. The original title was The Defense of the Christian Religion, so it tells me where he's coming from. It was a philosophical treatise that pushes pushes the unbeliever to his logical conclusions. If you reject God, what do you end up with? And he does something similar in the 1600s to what Francis Schaeffer did in the mid 1900s. Schaeffer was addressing, they didn't have the term yet when Schaeffer was addressing postmodernism. And so he took some of those ideas, it wasn't called that yet. He took some of those ideas and pushed them to their logical conclusion to show that without God, without the Christian view of God, you are left in despair. And he does that to say, okay, now there you are in despair, but there's hope. Let me show you where the hope is. The hope is found in Jesus Christ. And Blaise Pascal is doing much the same thing. His work was not completed. A great deal of it was done, but it wasn't completed at his death. And so it comes down to us in its incomplete form. He says, men despise religion. They hate it and fear it is true. And notice you don't hate something that's not true. It's sort of hard to hate, an imaginary fairy tale. They hate it and fear that it is true. To remedy this, we must begin by showing that religion is not contrary to reason. He continues that it is venerable, to inspire respect for it, and then we must make it lovable, to make good men hope it is true, and finally we must prove that it is true. And this is what he's seeking to do. He says Christianity is strange. It bids man recognize that he is vile, even abominable, and bids him desire to be like God. Without such a counterpoise, that dignity would make him horribly vain, or this humiliation would make him terribly abject. Now, we move from there. I want to move in the second part of our time and look at the political revolution. Remember how we said that it led to both a spiritual revolution against the church, against authorities and things like that, but also a political revolution as well. And so, a few names we want to look at. Thomas Hobbes, his book Leviathan, and he suggests that people contend for their desires. They want something, and that leads to conflict, and they need a strong ruler to stop anarchy, or else it's just everybody taking everything from anybody. And so, a strong ruler is needed. Now, notice we're talking politics. Locke comes along. He says it's the duty of government to provide three basic rights: life, liberty, and property. That each one, is interconnected. You have Montesquieu, who suggests governments would do good with a separation of powers. You have the executive, whether that's the king or somebody that's in charge of everything. The legislative, that which passes laws. Think about England with its king, but also its parliament. And then the judicial, one who actually enforces the law. So the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. Rousseau, um, he writes the social contract. Uh, this idea, this idea, he says that free people agree to bind themselves in a government. And if they're not agreeing, that means they're not free. But that people and government enter, whether it's written or not, they enter an agreement, a contract, where the governmental leader says, "Look, I'm going to keep the peace, and I'm going to provide, your freedom, and the people are going to support that government, whether they want to or not. They agree to do it. They're going to pay their taxes and sometimes, give of themselves in service." Uh, and that big nations need big government, or else it's just not going to be up to the task. And finally, Voltaire. Voltaire is one who rejects Christianity. In fact, he's the one who says if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. Now, that sounds like he's saying that against Christianity, and as I said, he doesn't see himself as a Christian, but he sees some value in Christianity. And when he says that, he's not trying to put Christianity down. He's saying no, even though I don't agree with it, there's value there in bringing order and of course there he lives in a day where there's been terrible wars over beliefs. Remember the 30 Years' War that had taken place. And so because of this, he sees the desire to separate church and state. This idea of separation of church and state, you hadn't seen that in any government or country previous to that, and he's suggesting that. Notice that's going to be the idea is going to be swallowed by a number of governments, whether it's put into their constitution or not. The idea is going to be floated out there, and it's going to be accepted, and still is by a lot of people today. Now, you'd had this idea taken from the scriptures, the divine right of kings. It's taken from Romans chapter 13 that says God is the one who establishes authority. And so the kings thought, well, if God establishes authority, then we have the authority, and it's given by God. Um, and Hobbes, under that category, said, well, men need strong rulers to avoid anarchy. We already said Locke, the basic rights, life, liberty, property, that Montesquieu had said, yes, but there should be a separation of powers between the executive, the legislative, the judicial. All power in the hands of one man is a tyranny. And so by separating it, you can have a reasonable balance between them. Rousseau with his social contract, and Voltaire with his separation of church and state. And all of these inputs, notice there's almost like a flow to them, will result in an age of revolution. Now, before we look at that, and we're only going to look briefly, we're only introducing this. I want to contrast the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. We may have seen this already, so if we have, then it just bears repeating. In the Renaissance, we had looked back to the Greek and Roman classics, and remember that had led to the Reformation, which said, "Well, let's go back to the original Bible. What does the Bible say in Greek and in Hebrew?" Um, but then that led to the questioning of authority, and now we're looking to science and philosophy in the Enlightenment because those things have been questioned. The Renaissance had Christian presuppositions. Obviously, the Reformation was based upon those Christian presuppositions, whereas in the Enlightenment, there are still Christians there, but there is a growing tendency of some, not all, but some, toward deism, toward seeing God as removed and not really relevant to our discussion, especially when it comes to politics. In the Renaissance had been focused mostly in Italy. The Reformation more in the northern countries, think Germany and the Netherlands and England. The Enlightenment, also France and England. So it's a child not of the Renaissance, but of the Reformation. The Renaissance, you'd had the divine right of kings unquestioned. Now we have a growing emphasis on the rights of man. The Renaissance had led to Reformation. Now the Enlightenment is going to lead to an age of revolution. Now, this age of revolution will begin in the Americas, 1775. The following year, they'll issue a Declaration of Independence, and you'll see this movement toward the American colonies becoming independent from England. It will have its counterpart 10 years later in the French Revolution, and we're going to actually contrast the two of those. But then this will touch off a whole series of revolutions. First in the West, you'll have Haiti, you have Colombia, you have Argentina. Brazil's an interesting subject unto itself, and finally Mexico. And meanwhile, in Europe, the French Revolution leading to Napoleon Bonaparte, but that will be put down in Europe. Napoleon himself is conquered at the Battle of Waterloo. And then Europe is going to say, for a time, they're going to put the lid on any sort of revolutionary activity. No, let's go back to the way it used to be. Let's have kings only. And they'll hold that, and they'll hold that, and they'll hold that until the mid 1800s, and then it will burst forth, and the age of revolutions will catch up in Europe. But I said there's a contrast between the French and the American Revolution, and we'll close on this note. In France, the French Revolution, very violent in character. You say, well, wasn't the American Revolution violent? They sought to have a peaceful separation. And it wasn't, let's go out and kill everybody that has money or anything like that. Compared to the French Revolution, yeah, yes, there was war, but the French Revolution was a war against its own society within society. Uh, Led to the reign of terror, some very bad things that took place. In the French Revolution, that's 1789. The American Revolution, we said 1775 actually begins, and then the following year is the Declaration of Independence, so 10 years earlier. The French Revolution, brought about by a financial crisis of national debt. The American Revolution, taxation without representation. So there was money involved in both cases. In the case of the American Revolution, it led to the Declaration of Independence. In the French Revolution, it led to what was called the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Similar, and yet some very big differences between the two. In the French Revolution, the idea was that the rights are subject to public order and public necessity. So the right to life, liberty, and property depended on whether they decided you really ought to have your life, liberty, or property. If the government needed that, then you're out of luck. The American Revolution actually had it led to the formation of a Bill of Rights, rights of people against their government, as opposed to the French, the rights of government sometimes against their people. Um, with the French Revolution, we see a confiscation of church property. They're actually going to seek to overturn religion and Christianity and set up a religion of the state. With the American Revolution, you have a high degree of respect for religion. Yes, the Anglican Church in the colonies, the new United States, is going to take on a new form. It will be called the Episcopal Church instead of the Anglican Church, because Anglican that just means the Church of England. So we'll even keep the church, but we'll change the name and we'll change where we do it. But a high degree of respect for religion. With the American Revolution, that's going to result in a democratic republic. With the French Revolution, ultimately, that will result in a military dictatorship, Napoleon Bonaparte, before it returns to the age of the kings. But we'll see that in a future class.